It is such an honor to have found time. This person is an incredibly busy human being, and so the fact that they're dedicating an hour to us community is such a gift. And I'd like to welcome Jim Simpson to the screen, who has served as the executive director of the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University since its creation in 2021. Before joining Georgetown, he served as a political director at Sojourners, a Christian advocacy organization focused on social justice issues. And prior to that, he served as a legislative aide to Senator Mary. I'm not going to remember her name or say her name right. I'll let you say that, Jim, who was a Democrat from Louisiana. And then you were also a legislative correspondent on the Democratic staff of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, following other internships. And just so you all know, if you haven't heard of the Center on Faith and Justice, the Center on Faith and Justice, along with the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law, has organized a lawsuit at the beginning of the year against the federal government on behalf of more than 24 religious groups in response to the administration's policy allowing immigrant agents more leeway to make arrests at sensitive locations, including houses of worship, and not just houses of worship. We'll learn what sensitive locations are today. So we hope that you are willing to ask all of the questions, that you have an expert here. You have somebody who is probably definitely not getting enough sleep through these times, but we are grateful that you have committed yourself, Jim, and your colleagues to this work, and welcome. It is such a gift to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. How's your spirit? How's your soul? Since we're talking about nurture the soul, how's your soul?
Yeah. My soul, I would say, is heavy right now. Heavy, but maybe also hopeful. And obviously heavy because of the amount of injustices and the amount of trauma and fear that we're seeing stoked in this country, from people that have theoretically been elected to serve and protect and defend our country and the people within it. I think hopeful, though, because I think what we're seeing is a groundswell of people who are coming to realize that the values coming from many in politics and others throughout the country are contrary to the values that we hold dearly. Particularly, I think people of faith are seeing that what we are experiencing right now is distinctly at odds with the values that our various traditions, and in my case, and I think most of us on here, are Christian traditions. And so what we're seeing a lot is many of our core tenets of faith and beliefs are being challenged right now. And I think at first, a lot of people were kind of surprised and shocked and frozen. But what I'm seeing now is a growing willingness and interest in being active and engaged in this moment. And I think that's what will not just help us resist and get through the worst of this, but I think that's what's needed to actually bring us forward to a more inclusive, a more full and fulfilling future for everyone. So
love, and I really, Jim, how you very poignantly stated that it is heavy and both hopeful. It's like recognizing that we can be multitudes of things, feel multitudes of things. And I think it's really important. We become so one-sided. We're either this way or this way that we miss the nuance of our true humanity in the in-between. Yeah. And so, and I love that you find hope in others becoming activated in very, very good ways. So I want to thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about you and your work, and then really kind of like, how is it that this case fell into your lap? Like, how is it that you at the Center of Faith and Justice at Georgetown University were positioned to take on this case?
Yeah. Well, so a little bit about me, and so I'll jump in. Senator Landrew. That's how you say it. It's one of those. For those that don't know, the Landrews are a pretty poignant political, I guess you can call it dynasty, but a family in Louisiana. But they're one of those like great Louisiana French names where there's like four vowels thrown together at the end there. But so yeah, Senator Mary Landrieu. Yeah, I mean, so I think I grew up in the Presbyterian Church USA, and my father is an ordained minister in the PCUSA. My mom is by training a Bible scholar. She's taught Old Testament and other things. So, kind of growing up, faith was core to my own upbringing, and kind of overlaid onto that, my other passion and interest throughout my life has always been politics. And so, needless to say, I'm a great Thanksgiving dinner guest, because those are the things I want to talk about. And so, in my own journey, not knowing exactly sort of where my life journey was going to take, at a time I thought that I would go to seminary and potentially seek ordination in the Presbyterian Church. Life has a way. I was offered a position in the United States Senate right at the time that I was accepting some offers to go to seminary, and I figured it would be easier for me to spend time working in the Senate and then go back to seminary rather than go away to seminary and then come back and get a job in the Senate. But life has a way of taking off, and so in the end, I never went back to that. But so I worked in the Senate for 5 years, and in 2014, my then boss, Senator Mary Landrieu, was running against now Senator Bill Cassidy, and in that election, to bring it kind of all the way back to what we're facing now, that election in 2014 basically became for them a referendum on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and Senator Landrieu, my boss, was clear throughout that despite it showing that it wasn't particularly popular in terms of electoral polling, she was clear throughout that if she had to take the vote again, she would vote in favor of the Affordable Care Act. And so I think we were all really proud of her for sort of standing by her values on that. But in the end, she lost her reelection. So at that point, I was looking for a new way to carry out my vocation. And I've long been a reader and a follower of both Reverend Jim Wallace and Sojourners, the organization. And it just so happened they had a position available that I was really interested in. And so starting in January 2015, shortly after the elections, I started at Sojourners. And that was a sort of being on the opposite side of the table, having been a congressional staff person, but now doing advocacy work from the other side. It was a really eye-opening experience, and to be able to bring fully into that work my faith and my beliefs was a really liberating thing for me. And fast forward to now, when Reverend Jim Wallace was getting ready to transition out of Sojourners after 50 years of leadership, he was invited to join the faculty at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, and at the same time create the Center on Faith and Justice. And he invited me to come with him. And despite not really having much interest about joining an academic setting, we were really wonderfully invited by the then president of Georgetown, President Jack DeGioia, to really deeply engage in the sort of missional advocacy work that Jim and I had historically done together. And so we kind of uniquely within an academic space get to do that. And so that kind of brings me into this current moment with the Center on Faith and Justice. And back in December, NBC News, it was like mid-December, NBC News broke the story that President Trump, then President-elect Trump, said that on day one, he was planning to get rid of the Department of Homeland Security's sensitive locations policy. In order to fulfill his promises and his desires of carrying out a campaign of mass deportation. And this is interesting because in his first term, President Trump never touched this policy. It was not something he ever changed. So this is a policy that has existed and been in place since in various forms since the 90s, and in its current form since 2011. And since George H.W. Bush onwards, every president until now has respected the nature of this policy that says, in our society, in the United States, we believe that there are certain places that are important and significant enough that we want to ensure that we don't conduct law enforcement detentions and raids within them. And because the disruption to those places would cause trauma and would cause impact. And so there are a number of locations that are designated as sensitive locations. Obviously, for our purposes, houses of worship is one of them. It also includes schools, it includes hospitals, and it includes public demonstrations. So, obviously, if you've got a lot of people marching or protesting, what you don't want to have happen is in the midst of that to have law enforcement coming into those spaces and sort of seizing people and removing them from it. And so NBC News broke this in mid December. I mentioned I'm a member of a Presbyterian church here in Washington, D.C., and I serve as an elder in our church, so sort of part of the church's governing group. And that the same night that news broke, we were having a session meeting at our church, and one of my fellow members of the session happens to also be the Supreme Court director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown. And so while we both work at Georgetown, and we had known that and we had seen one another around, and we always sort of asked about one another's work, we had never prior to this had never had an opportunity to work together, or a reason to work together, I should say. And during our session meeting, I mentioned in kind of an offhanded way that, hey, amongst the things we might need to be considering come early next year is Donald Trump now saying that among the many things he was going to do on day one, that he was going to get rid of this really critical protection for houses of worship. And after our session meeting, my colleague Kelsey came up to me and said, hey, through your work, and work closely with lots of different religious leaders and denominations and faith groups and, faith-based organizations. So, kind of everyone in the faith-based landscape. At ICAP, what we do is bring lawsuits. Like they're a legal team. The ICAP is a public interest litigation firm. So they take on in a pro bono way clients to represent them in lawsuits. And she said, maybe this is something we consider working together on. So it snowballed from there as things like this tend to do. And so starting in December, Kelsey and I and the ICAP team and others at the Center on Faith and Justice, we began reaching out to heads of denominations, heads of faith-based organizations, other people in the immigration space. A great example, and I'm going to be saying his name a number of times during this call, but Noel Anderson, who is at Church World Service, but also works with UCC. And so, we reached out to a lot of partners saying, hey, we're expecting this to happen, and we now have the opportunity to potentially prepare a lawsuit for when and if they do indeed rescind the policy. And so, starting then, working over the holiday break, over Christmas and New Year, we began to organize folks to potentially participate in this. And by early February, we were ready to file a lawsuit, which is officially titled Mennonite Church USA et al. Versus United States Department of Homeland Security et al. And it was filed in district court here in Washington, D.C. It's a lawsuit that represents, as you said, 27 different Christian and Jewish ecumenical groups and denominations. Collectively, the plaintiffs represent tens of thousands of houses of worship. They represent tens of millions of people of faith. And so we were suing the Department of Homeland Security to essentially say that removing this policy and therefore opening the door for ICE and CBP to be able to carry out detentions in and around houses of worship was going to harm the religious rights and religious freedoms of people of faith in the United States. So I'll stop there.
That was so much. I took so many notes, and thank you for listing out what sensitive locations are. I had no idea that public demonstrations fall under that.
Yeah.
Which explains why there's never that direct. Fascinating. I have so many other questions offline, not related to this on that. I want to veer off and build on what you just shared, though. You had said, shortly after the election, Donald Trump, our current president, made that announcement, right? Mm-hmm. So it was like, here's my card. What are you going to do now that I'm playing it?
Yeah.
And you all collectively came together in the next 3 months to strategize and figure something out. I want to ask you a little bit more, if you could go deeper into that. And the reason why I ask is, in my role, both nationally here with the United Church of Christ, I'm congregational and community engagement, right? And so that's helping to invite congregations to imagine what it looks like to do the work inside and outside their building. But in my own community organizing in the state that I reside in, what I have come to understand is that not only are there different organizing models, but there really is the type of populations that you're organizing alongside or for or with, those that changes your methodology. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes the problems are so big, the relationships haven't been fully, completely established, mm-hmm. for there to be trust and all of that kind of stuff, that oftentimes, speaking for myself as well, we go into the freeze mode. It's too big. I don't know where to start. Or even I do work with people who are incarcerated. I don't do work with people who are migrating to the country, as an example, right? Mm-hmm. So how is it that you found yourselves in that collective, like, how did it start? And then how have you cultivated those relationships with, I imagine, probably a daily change of what needs to happen?
Yeah, I think to begin with, as often happens, you kind of start where you are or with what resources or relationships you do have. From my time at Sojourners and my work with Jim Wallace, we know collectively quite a lot of people in the kind of like broader, both Christian and interfaith landscape of folks in the U.S. Having said that, of course, there's lots of people we don't know. But so I think we started out by thinking about the first thing was Kelsey and the team at ICAP thinking through legally how they thought they could achieve standing in this case. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about this case is that this case is actually not on behalf of the rights of immigrants, which might seem strange, right? Because ultimately they're the communities that are they are the people and the individuals that are really at risk here. But so what it was decided was that we were going to try and bring a lawsuit on behalf of the congregations and the members within those congregations, saying that their religious liberties and freedoms, which are in the United States, of course, there's the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom, of belief. As well as in the United States, there's what's called the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, which is a law passed by Congress, which essentially amounts to being a super statute in as much as it is a law that is applicable to all other laws and all other executive actions and enforcements and everything else. So any law that Congress passes or any action that the federal government through the executive branch takes has to be compliant with the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act. And the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act restricts the government from any effort that would substantially burden is the verbiage that is used, substantially burden the exercise of religion. And in the law, it says, even if the burden results from the rule of a general applicability. And so basically it says that the government has a compelling interest to ensure that any law or any action taken by the government is conducted in the least restrictive means of furthering that government interest. And so it became clear through ICAP's incredible legal acumen and wisdom and experience that they thought the way to bring about this lawsuit that would most clearly define and establish standing on behalf of the plaintiffs groups was to say that by rescinding this policy, the government is unduly burdening in not the most least restrictive way the religious freedoms and rights of people. So I think I say that because we would have gone about this in a completely different way if the legal strategy was to try and bring a lawsuit on behalf of the rights of immigrants. right? And so because the lawsuit was going to be brought on behalf of churches and people of faith, we said, okay, how can we go about um, identifying the broadest way of bringing in as many religious communities as possible? Um, and so at that point, once we knew the kind of the means by which, from a legal standpoint, we were going to try and bring this lawsuit, then it became a question of, okay, um, to get a little bit into the weeds here, and I should note I'm not a lawyer, though I play one on TV, or on a Zoom webinar, as the case may be. But is to say, depending on how a particular denomination is structured, the polity, the governance, how it's incorporated, and how it's structured legally, we felt that there was a lot of congregations, or there was a lot of denominations where we could basically say, if the national denomination would be willing to sign on behalf of its member congregations, we could have one plaintiff that would cover thousands of churches, hundreds of thousands of members of that denomination. And so from there, we started to reach out to a lot of the heads of denominations, or we reached out as well to many states have state council of churches groups, right? So like state council of churches are really important networks, ecumenical groups that bring together cross-denominational groups. And so began sort of speaking to these groups. And candidly, in that first to your question, there was a lot of people that we were meeting for the first time doing this work. And I will say, I think what we tried to enter in with humility, but with purpose, to say, like, look, we don't mean to suggest that like other people can or could do this. They might be, but we also happen to be one of the groups that are. And so if you would like to learn more and potentially be a part of this, we welcomed anyone in who was interested. And so candidly, it was just a lot of Zoom calls, like that would have, some would have 12 people on them, others would have 97 people on them. We just scheduled a bunch of regular, recurring weekly webinar Zoom calls for people to figure out, do we feel like this is something we want to do? Is this something we can be a part of? I think the other main point I would say to all of this is, and again, this goes back to the incredible intelligence of the staff at ICAP, was to say, there is a means by which, as long as you have a named plaintiff, you can have anonymous declarants under that plaintiff. And so I think a lot of questions that came up in some of those initial conversations, in which a lot of individual pastors or clergy of individual congregations said, well, I'm really worried, because if we put our name to something like this, are we not just putting a target on our back for this administration to like come after us in retribution? And if this administration has shown one thing for certain, is that they're certainly not above that. And so again, the ICAP team figured that we could have individual congregations who could show the harm that has been caused to them through the government's actions, but without having to risk themselves by putting their name and their location and details into a legal document. So kind of through that process, we built a lot of relationships. I've got to say, I think this only worked in as much as people were willing to put trust and faith. And I think the fact that the ICAP team has represented a number of other religious groups before, and so I feel like there's trust that's there. But it was, people, I think in some cases where relationships weren't particularly strong, people were taking a real leap of faith in participating.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That was just vast, and thank you for that, because that we still often turn to the institution as, again, multiple things can exist at the same time. Many of us want to turn to the institution to protect our values and our interests and our laws and those things, while somebody else is turning the institution down. So it's good that those relationships have been built for such a long time. And so thank you for jumping into that. I'm curious, I'm going to jump ahead and come back, but I want to know, and we have lots of questions in the chat. Please keep putting them there. There's some good questions. We'll get there, I promise. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in there. Where are we now in regards to this case? Where Yeah, because I've heard multiple things, and and I'm even thinking about it. So for those who may not know, I am in the southwestern part of our country, in a state that is it is a border state in a lot of ways. And I know that because of our history and polity within the United Church of Christ, which is lovely, we were not named in that case. And so a number of the clergy within the United Church of Christ are worried about that they're not going to be protected if this and when, not if, but when it happens to us. And so I'm curious, where are we in that case? And do you know enough about our polity in that question to be able to help any conference or any pastor serving in a conference that didn't sign on to the lawsuit?
Yeah. Well, and so I'm not going to attempt to speak on behalf of the UCC
Thank you.
specifically, but what I will say is that there were lots of denominations that, in the end, either mostly in the end, decided that they didn't feel comfortable enough that their particular denomination's polity or governance really allowed them to do this. And in fact, I even know of some denominations who are trying to say, like, is there some way we can find kind of a loophole to let us participate in this? And I think in the end, what they decided was that in the end, while they might feel like the loophole was appropriate for this instance, it would set a precedent that maybe in the future could be used to try and do something that, maybe they didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And so, I understand. I have been reached out to people of many denominations asking the question of, like, why weren't we on it? And I think it's a fair question. But I would also, and we'll get to this later, there is, even despite maybe not being part of not being a named plaintiff, there is a lot that the UCC and other non-plaintiff denominations can and should be doing in this moment. So, like, being a part of the lawsuit is just one potential way to be a part of this. So in terms of where we are in this case and how it interacts with an entity like the UCC, I should note, there is one UCC, the Central Atlantic Conference of the UCC is actually a named plaintiff. So if you happen to be if you're on this webinar and you happen to be within that conference, you theoretically could be covered with this process. But so on April 4th, we had our first hearing, and it was a hearing on a preliminary injunction motion, where we were asking that until the case had been fully decided, we were asking the judge to say, like, for the time that this case is being litigated, we are going to put back in place the sensitive locations policy for plaintiffs. And this is an important distinction, because there are some cases, like the birthright citizenship case that's happening right now, in which they are asking for an injunction motion that would cover everyone in this country, right? And in this case, we weren't asking for that. We were asking only for a preliminary injunction that would cover the plaintiffs that were part of the lawsuit. And so one thing that's important to note is, even if the judge had ruled in our favor, the injunction motion putting the rescission, nullifying the rescission, would only have been applicable to people within or under the umbrella of named plaintiff groups. Okay. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, a week after our first hearing, we did receive the judge's ruling on that, and they declined to grant a preliminary injunction in the case. So at least for now, as the litigation continues, even the plaintiffs in this case are not protected by the sensitive locations policy that was in place before. Now, to your point, I think there's been quite a lot of mis or disinformation. I don't think it's disinformation. I think it's misinformation, right? People who are reading a particular way. And so I want to just share that. So the court denied the injunction because they determined that in their opinion, the plaintiffs didn't have standing to sue. And without standing, you can't file a lawsuit just because you disagree with a law or policy. You have to show that the policy harms you and that a court decision in your favor would limit the harm. And so the district court held that the withdrawal of the sensitive locations memo did not harm the plaintiffs because there was no, and this is their words, credible threat that ICE would enter their sanctuaries or their houses of worship. The judge's opinion noted that since the policy rescission, very few enforcement actions had taken place at or near or within churches. The opinion also said that we had not shown that any harm stemming from like declines in worship or declines in people using or seeking support from churches could be directly tied to the withdrawal of the memo as opposed to the Trump administration's broader immigration policies and posturing. And so, but, and this is the but, so yes, it is true they did not grant it. Some people have characterized it to say like they basically like threw out the preliminary injunction motion. And I would say that is not true. And the way the judge wrote it was basically to say, and these are my words, not the judge's words, but to say like, if there was new evidence of harm to the groups that could be presented to the judge could reconsider whether they have standing. And so, you know, some headlines and news coverage of this were kind of misleading or seemed to suggest that the court, you know, affirmed ICE's or CBP's authority to come into houses of worship. But really, it is far narrower than that and largely is focused around whether there was significant risk of enforcement actions taking place in houses of worship. So I think it's an initial ruling that the evidence we have put before the judge doesn't at this point present the sort of injury that the judge feels like is necessary to establish standing. And it's a disappointment, but it is not fatal for us. And I think, so I have to be careful about how I talk about this. One, because I'm not part of the plaintiff group, right? So I'm not actually represented in this case. The Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice is not a plaintiff. We wouldn't have standing. We're not a house of worship. But the team at ICAP, the legal team, is still reviewing the decision and they're assessing what their options are. Of course, we're still deeply concerned about it. But here's the thing. We have always known from the beginning that a lawsuit like this is a process that was going to take time. It was going to take a significant amount of time. And so this is just one step in a long process about around this lawsuit about where it goes. And I would expect that we will hear very soon some next steps in the lawsuit.
You know, Jim, I mean, I heard everything you said. And to summarize it, I must say, it reminds me of the UCC comma, our logo of the comma, because you never want to put a period when God is still speaking, right? So it's almost as, yes, it was the injunction decision, and it doesn't have to be over yet. And I'm going to ask a question that came in the Q&A, and I invite everyone to do that if possible. If you have not, if you have put a question into chat and it hasn't been a crowdsourced answer, which I see a lot of that happening, please do put it in the Q&A because it is too hard for me to go back through the chat. So copy and paste that into the Q&A feature, please. But I'm going to build on this question because I think that it relates to a little bit of what that comma, right? Somebody says, my congregation has agreed to join others in my metro area in a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security. Man has already been removed from a church in one local suburb. Our lawyers, however, recommended not filing until there is more activity that makes a stronger case that religion is being impinged upon. More detentions, lack of participation in religious services, etc. Sadly, I hate to wait until more people are harmed. Do you have advice on that? Like thinking about could this particular group now, is it too late to be added to that other lawsuit? And how can that decision by the smaller courts inform this particular group of people, perhaps?
Yeah. So I can't give legal advice. One, because I'm not a lawyer, and so I would say take anything I say around this as a grain of salt. When it's like relating to how particular
Yeah.
individual organizations are trying to think about this for themselves. I mean, this is one of the crazy things, right? Is we shouldn't have to, and this is my criticism of the system in this way. It's like we shouldn't have to wait until the risk is there in order to then be able to sort of call it out and call
Right.
it to question, right? However, and unfortunately, it seems like that's generally speaking is true. I will say, so our lawsuit is one of uh, I think that there is one other that's being run by Democracy Forward on behalf of a number of Quaker groups, a Gurdwara, and maybe it's a UCC church, maybe it's not, I forget. That is, they filed in Maryland, and their preliminary injunction was upheld. So I think one of the things about this is, um, you know, judges are free within their own jurisdictions to make decisions for themselves. So just because one judge in one district court jurisdiction ruled one way, there in another jurisdiction, a judge has ruled a different way on this question, even now. And so, I I would advise you to take seriously the word of any legal counsel you're receiving. But I do think that, I think that the more we are one of, I looked just before we got on this, there's a number of websites that are tracking lawsuits against the Trump administration right now. And, when I looked today, there were 223 active lawsuits against the Trump administration and their executive actions. There are more against the Trump administration, but specifically lawsuits against executive actions that the administration has taken. So, I think if you're not a part of this lawsuit and you feel compelled to do something about it, filing a lawsuit is on behalf of yourself and others within your community is an option. I think these are things you would have to decide for yourself. There is considerations like, do you have to pay a legal team to do this? That can become very costly. Again, the smaller and more narrow a lawsuit is, the easier it is to identify who individual actors are, and either from retaliation from the government, which again we are at a point now in our country where that is not it's not a guarantee that that won't happen, or retaliation on behalf of bad actors within a community, right, who maybe agree with the idea of mass deportations across the country. So, I do think you have to take seriously the security risks and the risk to be it nonprofit status or like just generally like the risk that an organization would take on filing this. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. When the lawsuit prevails, I'm going to return to the Q&A, and they said if, but I'm going to say when the lawsuit prevails in the end and gets everything at once, it's asking for, will non-plaintiff churches also get the benefit or protection?
Um, yeah, I don't know the answer to that, and I think it would depend upon whatever the final and ultimate ruling of the court would be on that. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. We can try and find
Yeah,
out.
that's okay. Out of all of, well, real quick, are courthouses considered sensitive locations?
So currently, under current law, there are no sensitive locations.
True.
Under the previous iteration, under the Mayorkas memo, which is what the previous sensitive location policy was, courthouses were not included. I'll get into this a little bit later, but when we get into what are some things you all can do, there is a piece of legislation that's been introduced in both the House and Senate that not only would put in place the prior sensitive locations, it would add other sensitive locations, including courthouses, which, as we've seen just in recent weeks, there was a very high-profile instance of a detention that was attempted to take place within a courthouse, and now we have a judge that has been arrested by the federal government over this. So clearly, courthouses are an important place to probably consider adding to the sensitive location list.
Yeah, I would love to be able to see, because like I've heard stories here locally in the Southwest of people who are showing up for their regular check-in who are now being detained and sent to. So it'd be interesting, even immigration offices being able to fall under that sensitive locations thing in that weird way as well. I'm glad to mention that you said we still have a Congress. I wasn't sure. Um, sorry,
Well,
y'all. That's a little bit of sarcasm on my part. I couldn't help, but so
sarcasm nurtures the soul
it
sometimes.
does. It's my love language. I'm sorry, y'all, but I'm really curious. You did tap a little bit on it. What are some of the ways in which you advise the faith in sensitive locations moving forward? Like, what is it that we can do both what's next with the lawsuit and what's next with thinking beyond the lawsuit, just based on your efforts and your work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I don't say this in a glib way, but prayer, 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 prayer. Philippians 4:6, do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. I think one of the things that sets apart the work that we've done through this lawsuit is there are a lot of lawsuits, but they are often led by secular entities and organizations, which even secular entities and organizations are made up of people who are people of faith. But I think one of the things that makes ours unique is it is an effort that is being led by people of faith. And so I say this genuinely and really is keep this process in your prayers. And I mean that both in terms of your own personal prayers, but I also think raising this in prayer within our congregations, um, most importantly, as a way to bring this to God, and at the same time use it as a way to raise awareness within congregations that this is still happening and that there's still work being done. So I think
Yeah.
prayer, and I see Noel is on here. I've got to say just a short plug. I've worked in the faith-based sort of advocacy landscape now for over 10 years. And I think one of the people that I have been most impressed by and that has just been a stalwart and that is so widely respected and trusted in that space is Reverend Noel Anderson, who works at Church World Service, but is a UCC ordained pastor. And he does a lot of work on behalf of your denomination on immigration. And he has been a tireless champion for many, many years, and including now. And I would say that I don't know. Maybe it's because Noel was upset that the UCC didn't join the lawsuit or what. But I think, despite not being a part of the lawsuit, through Noel and others that are part of the UCC, I think you all are actually one of the most active denominations that are doing some of the most important work around this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I love that. Thanks. Go ahead, Noel.
Thank you so much for the plug, Jim. You know that I feel very mutually about you and your work at the Center of Faith and Justice. And it's been, the fact that you all were able to get these 27 religious groups together and that are pushing forward the way that you are, and the also the work you did on the Hill leading up, the advocacy visits on the Hill for the legislation for sensitive locations, as well as I think probably the biggest sort of faith vigil we've really had so far around this issue. This in the new Trump era in DC, that was really an incredible vigil, and I know I sent a lot of folk there, and they were all very happy that they went. And I know a lot of UCC people were there. So thank you so much for your leadership. And I don't have too much to add other than I think we need to continue to do that same type of advocacy and mobilization and organizing around sensitive locations. And, we've been challenged in the sanctuary movement work where some feel like, oh, without sensitive locations, we can no longer do sanctuary in the same way. I think that's also a broader context of the way people are being targeted. We don't want to put anyone in harm's way. So, there are ways to continue the accompaniment work, continue the sanctuary work. There are congregations that are still declaring publicly that they're sanctuary, but we're always doing that in a cognizant way of trying to make sure that we are protecting the people we're walking in solidarity with. And I think that the sensitive locations litigation could open up new doors for us to not only to grow the sanctuary movement work in a very difficult time once again, but to also wedge our opposition. Because the reality is that the majority of the population does not support this type of extreme family separation, the idea of going into churches and schools and hospitals. Nobody likes these ideas except for the most extreme anti-immigrant people. And so I think that as people of faith, we can draw upon those values of faith, and we can mobilize our fellow faith communities and even reach across sort of are denominational or theological divides within faith communities to really make a strong point. And the litigation really creates a platform for that. And as was mentioned already, there is some really unfortunate ways in which the judge decided to rule, but there is also not just this litigation, and there's been some confusion about just what it is the judge actually said. And I know Georgetown, because you all are litigating, are not exactly in the position to sort of create public resources. So one of our colleagues, who's also a great resource, and her expertise is more around Religious Freedom Restoration Act and those claims. And of course, REFRA is part of this lawsuit. And so she's from Columbia Law. Liz, I don't want to pronounce her name wrong. I put it in the chat here. Um,
Reiner
Liz
Platt.
Rayner Black. Yes, yes, the director of the Law and Religion Project, Law, Rights and Religion Project at Columbia. And so she did put together sort of a very basic fact sheet about all of the different sensitive locations, litigations, and it just is becoming public. And in fact, IPAC from Georgetown did sort of proof it to make sure it was okay. So that I think is going to be a new helpful resource on this because, as was mentioned, there is a lot of confusion. I was really disappointed with some of the reporting, and it makes makes me remember that reporters don't get everything right sometimes, and they can be sensationalist, and we do need to do our research. And so that's the type of this type of webinar. Thank you again, Ellie, for putting this together, and Andrea and others. Thank you again, Jim, for being on it. It is really helpful to hear all of your perspectives on this and really get the information we need to do our mobilizing and organizing right now.
Well, while I have you both on, and thank you, Noel, for that. Thank you, Jim, as well. Even though, like the sanction, even though the idea of sensitive locations doesn't exist anymore, can I still enter a facility without a judicial warrant?
So I think there is not like a clear and obvious answer to that. This is probably when we talked about sending resources around. Noel, I'm sure you might have some, and there are others that I can direct us to in terms of guidance that churches can consider when trying to establish policies and protocols that can, as much as possible, protect folks that are inside of the church. I don't want to speak to like individual. I know like there's been questions about what can we do. It's so contextualized to individual circumstances that it's hard to just give blanket statements on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there are some good resources. We can compile them. I've been having trouble getting approval for it on sort of a know your rights type thing for congregations. But I think that the gist of it is, to designate where the public and private spaces are, and that ICE cannot go into private spaces without a judicial warrant. And so trying to educate our congregations about that. I think where that gets really tricky is around our weekly worship on Sundays, because we just, I think it's probably not feasible to make the argument that that's somehow a private space. But we could say that, because there's so many allies, generally speaking, in that public space, that it may not be the time in which ICE actually wants to go into a church, but they could, and that is a scary prospect, I think. But designating those private spaces, ICE should not be going into those private spaces, and it is important to educate our staff, because one of the ways ICE often enters private spaces is by consent, and any law enforcement, right? And a lot of times they ask for consent in a way that is manipulative and makes people think that they must must go along with giving consent for entry or search.
Yeah, and so this is a great example, though. So within our lawsuit, again, going back to my earlier point, where the lawsuit was brought on behalf of infringement of religious liberties and rights of people of faith and communities of faith. And so, one of the arguments that that our side put forward was this idea that people of faith would have to consider making sanctuaries during worship private, closed spaces is contrary to our biblical understanding of welcome and inclusion, right? So by making churches potentially subject to detention, such that a church might have to consider whether or not they consider or deem or publicly make a sanctuary, a literal sanctuary, as visibly public or private. That is a disruption of our practices, right? So this all comes back to the question of, like, where is harm and where is standing within this case, and what does the judge or the judicial system consider to be an infringement on religious liberties or rights?
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Noel.
Those are really important points. And I mean, the other thing that pastors like us, or people like Jim and I, always have to say again and again, right, is we're not lawyers, and that it's always helpful to consult a lawyer locally on these. And I'm not providing legal advice, but I would say, do the local trainings on the Know Your Rights for your congregation. Most chapters of ACLU and or other type of movement lawyers do have prepared similar types of trainings, and to do that, that's also an important way to sort of mobilize your community.
I also
Thank
saw
you
just
for
in the chat, I would call
yeah.
out, I saw Reverend Michael Neuroth, who again is just another great colleague and partner in all this work. He put in some UCC specific resources that are on there. So I would just draw your attention to those.
Thank you for that. Why was there a reason why Roman Catholic dioceses were not included in the lawsuit?
No, that was a matter of there were conversations, but there was no, they were one of the many different denominations and churches that were considering whether or not they would be able to be a part of it.
And to what degree is law enforcement claiming the quote unquote hot pursuit doctrine to enter sensitive spaces?
Well, so I mean, to be fair, this is where, even with the previous policy in place, there were exceptions for things like hot pursuit. So this idea, I think one of the more frustrating things was I, along with many others, sat in on the courthouse during our initial hearing. And one of the points that the defense, those representing the government, the lawyers from the Department of Justice, made was that the administration and the government has been clear that that carrying out detentions and raids within houses of worship or other sensitive locations is not a priority for the administration. And of course, the clear and obvious sort of response to that is, well, then why would you, if it's not a priority, why would you have changed the policy? Especially because, again, under the first Trump administration, they did not rescind this, and because even when it was in place, there are exceptions that allow ICE and CBP and other law enforcement agents to still carry out detentions in and around sensitive locations if they had the prior approval to do so, or in instances where there was sort of a hot pursuit situation. So.
I love that. Somebody has asked a question at the very beginning that said our church is making an effort to print and hand out the red cards and make them available at different spaces within our community. They're wondering if that makes sense because they talk about the steps for due process. And since due process is a process that's being ignored now, are they really spreading misinformation in that case?
Yeah, I would say sharing any resources that are factually based and that are rooted in what are established legal principles for this country is important. The extent to which the government chooses to adhere to those practices and laws is not ours to do. And so I do think sharing information is important. I also think, and again, this is where Noel and others have a lot of other resources I'm sure they could direct to, and I can share some later. But there are some preemptive trainings that we can certainly share with folks that we know who are immigrants or who are part of immigrant communities that help people think about what are some proactive steps I can be taking to as much as possible protect myself and prepare myself and my family in the instance that something should happen. And so I think those are really important things too.
Yeah, and I'll just say I just came from, and that's why I'm in the car right now, a conference called the Immigration Movement Visioning Process. And there's a lot of executive directors with large immigrants' rights organizations from places like New York, Chicago, DC, LA. And everybody here has said that the Know Your Rights education has been extremely successful.
Yeah.
And that has really slowed down the number of deportations that this administration has been able to manifest. And in a lot of ways is one of the reasons why they're trying to do all of these extreme measures with invoking the Alien Enemies Act and whatnot, because, and I think it's going to continue to be a level of theater and from the administration on immigration because they're having trouble getting the numbers they want. That I think that would and could change if ICE starts taking more extreme tactics, what they might do. And also, I think that we're going to see, a very important fight coming down. And so we can do a whole nother webinar on the reconciliation fight. And we really need to stop the increased budget that would be, potentially twice, the $9 billion ICE already has per year. And that extra money could really cause a lot of havoc and extra capacity. So definitely we need to be doing the advocacy to put a stop to that bill, as well as, we don't want Medicaid cuts, et cetera, but I know we're at our end of our time, so I won't go deep into that.
Oh, no, I know we'll be with you next week. And I do want to share some things that I know are happening within houses of worship from all across the country. I've heard the continuing of the Know Your Rights, clinics, taking those cards, handing them out, putting them in the back of the bathroom stalls in public restrooms, those kind of things. I've heard of houses of worship doing meal trains. So we know that attendance in public settings amongst our underdocumented folks have gone down. And so when it's gone down, how do you get your groceries? How do you do all these things? So hopefully you built those relationships in order to host meal trains of foods that are ethnically responsible to the culture in which you're trying to support. I've heard about language programs. There are people who, I know a lot of community colleges do your GED classes or your ESL classes. And so there are a lot of people that are in the queue still waiting. And so how is it that we can work with them to, in our language programs? I've heard nursery school, elementary school for parents who are no longer allowing their kids to attend schools because of the fear. How is it that we have turned our houses of worship into private spaces to do math, English, those kind of things? Welcoming people. Say thank you for being in our country. You make it a better place, right? Noel and I have worked with a pastor in Arizona, and they're down in the border. And the first thing when people were crossing over at one point, they were like, thank you. Thank you for coming to our country and making it a better place. We welcome you and we love you, right? Bail funds. So when you are out protesting, when you are out doing public demonstrations, and if somebody does get apprehended or whatever, can your church already have a set of bail funds available and or funds to help pay for medical care if there is an option, if there is a need around the medical care? This is stuff that I've heard. And then here in Arizona, we have had public demonstrations in front of the detention centers almost every week. And that could be not just demonstrating, and it is singing songs, it is praying in multiple religious expressions in different languages. It's holding up public art signs to let them know that they are loved and that they haven't been forgotten about, right? And so there are so many different ways that houses of worship can get engaged. You just have to invite your curious and loving spirit in, right? And then bring others alongside with you. Amen. Jim, any final thoughts, questions? What, maybe sharing one, what is it that you learned? What is it that whatever it is, whatever you want to share, do it.
Yeah. I just continue to be so lifted up by, I've seen today, 100 odd people who are filled with the Spirit and are feeling called to learn more and engage more around these this and other topics. And I think there is a lot that you all can do. I'm someone who, as I shared in my background, sort of religion, the intersection of religion and politics is kind of core to who I am and how I see the world. And so among all the things that you just said, Reverend Ellie, and things that Noel raised as well, I just really want to underscore the importance of making your voice heard, in particular with your legislators. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. You can certainly call your members of Congress. You can write your members of Congress. Michael, who's on here, has got a lot of, there's some actions around SNAP and Medicaid and budget cuts. So like your denomination has lots of great resources for how you can get engaged in this work. And then I think just making your voice heard, we're encouraging churches to organize vigils or actions within their community. Just having, or if there's, like the hands-off protests that happened a while back, just like showing up as a person of faith, showing that, pushing back against this narrative, which is out there, which is this idea that like sort of all Christians support Donald Trump and all Christians are being silent in this moment. I think a really profound way to share witness and share gospel with people around is just being there and being present and being active and showing up with your faith. So.
Oh, I love it, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know how busy you are, and I know that I'm grateful to Noel for Noel's work, and then of course Noel's connection to you, Jim. I just hope to continue to work and support all that it is that you're doing. Know that I have prayed for you, and I know others are praying for you and everyone that is uplifted in today's conversation. I want to thank all of you. The crowdsourcing that was happening in the chat, I've never seen anything like it. And I've been hosting Nurture the Soul webinars for about a year now. So thank you, beloveds, for showing up for each other here in this space, here in the chat, here in the Q&A. It's just, I just love you all. I got goosebumps. I'm getting all emotional. I do want to invite you to join us for our next webinar on Monday, May 12th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time for our next installment of the What's Next series. The What's Next series began prior to the 2024 election and is designed to help educate us around the big questions of our faith. The special offering was curated to push back on that political ideology and the divide that has become this nation's religion. And I'm using air quotes around religion. So to live into that still speaking God, we are the embodiment of who and what we are called to be to one another, whether it be spiritually, culturally, or lovingly during a time when we are being pulled apart at the seams. And part of this embodiment is examining the ways in which art speaks and moves us towards expression and collectiveness. We're not just the brains, beloveds. We're just not the spirit. We are the whole body. And so in this session, we're going to be joined by Reverend Dr. Dante McGilvery, who's going to share insights from their recent work using theater to amplify unheard voices, to advocate for justice, and bring overlooked stories to the stage. We're also going to explore how he even took the smallest resources, the stuff that was sitting in the children's room at the church for 15 years and didn't know what to do with it. He gathered that and created a public art display to demonstrate God's love and care for all. So whether you're an artist, an educator, an activist, a pastor, a congregation member, a mother, a father, an auntie, an uncle, whatever, you're going to be inspired to use what you have to create an impact where you are. Reverend Dante is just, I just enjoyed planning this webinar with him. And so we look forward to seeing and having you be with us on Monday. Beloveds, I invite you to settle in for our benediction, kind of shake it all out. You know, again, we're our whole bodies. We've had a lot of information come at us. Some of it clear, some of it maybe perhaps more confusing, but in the end, we got to be together. We got to be curious. We got to hear from people who have dedicated their calling out of ministry into this work to care for all of God's creation. And so, beloveds, I invite you to close your eyes. Oh, God, thank you for the gift of your people. Through your sacred scriptures, you have given us so many opportunities to learn the varying ways in which we are called to love. And in those same scriptures, you have given us so many examples to learn what not to do, what to avoid. And so be with each of those who have tuned into this webinar live, who will be tuning in at a later time, as we continue to discern how to be the hands and feet of Jesus and to continue to ask ourselves and be ready for the whole embodied experience of picking up your cross and carrying it forward. In your many names we pray. Be with us, love on us, give us joy, give us rest. Amen. Bye for now, beloved. See you on Monday.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.